over before the game was done. Now if you think that I'm gonna let you run my body, my heart, and my mind, then you better listen, son. Oh, you think you're invaluable, yeah, act like an eagle. Think you're gonna soar like a bird beyond impossible. I think it's plain to see, you know you're meant to be more swords to world serve too. Gotta think and stop. What you want ain't always what you get.
Boom, shaka, laka, ladies and gentlemen, freaks and geeks, brothers and sisters around the world, welcome to the Christian Journey podcast. It has been some time since I dropped a solo podcast, and I felt it would be rather appropriate to do so, particularly in light of last week, tragic incident in Florida regarding 17 innocent people being murdered. And it's times like this that we see the most emotional debates going on in regards to freedom, gun rights, in regards to people's right to defend themselves. This question of whether or not people have a right to their security, or whether or not they have a right to their right to defend themselves, to defend the most sacred of all rights, your right to life, your right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But these rights cannot be without the right to defend them. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to start by checking out a video that's been going viral over the last few days. Seems the students, or one of the students, that suffered the repercussions of seeing this horrible incident ruin the lives of so many people close to her, has decided to speak out about the laws in the United States, particularly the Second Amendment, and how something needs to be done about this tragic incident to ensure that this stuff never happens again. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to touch on this issue and touch on a few issues regarding freedom. Not because I have any political agenda. I mean, fundamentally, I don't believe in politics. I believe, if anything, I believe in freedom. I believe the right of people to do anything they want, provided they are not harming anyone in the process. Now, I realize that phrase is a platitude, but it's very loaded. People have subjective ideas on what harm is. Often conflate potential harm with actual harm. Often have different ideas as to what rights are. And there's always this question as to whether or not the line is being crossed, whether or not the line between freedom and security has moved too far into one region. Now, of course, people are always on different scales. There are some people that want a little bit of freedom, but want a little bit of security. And then there are others that will never compromise their freedom for security. As Benjamin Franklin once said, help me out here. Those that compromise their freedom for security deserve neither freedom or security. Understandably, because historically, the justification that has been used to enact all forms of authoritative regimes has always predicated on the idea of, what about the children? What about my family? The next time someone hurts my child, it's your fault. It's going to be their blood on your hands. And you're responsible for the actions of other people, unless, of course, you allow me to get the government to pass these authoritative laws to take away your rights, because we got to do it to protect people. Now, I know that this is a sensitive issue, and I probably shouldn't be making light of it. But hey, I think life is too important to be taken seriously. But no mistake, this is not an issue that should be taken lightly. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a look at this video here in regards to one of the students that suffered at the hands of this barbarous act. Let's see what she had to say in regards to it.
Single person up here today, all these people should be at home grieving. But instead we are up here, standing together, because if all our government and president can do is send thoughts and prayers, then it's time for victims to be the change that we need to see. Constitution, our guns have developed at a rate that leaves me dizzy. The guns have changed and the laws have not. We certainly do not understand why it should be harder to make plans with friends on weekends than it is to buy an automatic or semi-automatic weapon. In Florida...
Let's have a look at that point again, because this is a common argument that is made in the States in regards to the laws. I mean, we have arbitrary, ridiculous laws. One law where it's not possible to buy alcoholic beverages until you're 21, but apparently you can buy guns at the age of 18. Let's have a look at that law.
We certainly do not understand why it should be harder to make plans with friends on weekends than it is to buy an auto.
Yeah, to make plans with friends on weekends. So she's making reference to a law in the United States. I think this is in Florida, where it's perfectly acceptable to purchase guns at a particular age, let's say at the age of 18, but you can't buy alcoholic beverages. And it seems the logic is, well, hey, rather than changing this law, which is, by the way, violating people's individual rights, I mean, fundamentally, the whole idea within the Declaration of Independence, and this comes down to the whole philosophy of why the Second Amendment is there. In the Declaration of Independence, it is stated that we hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning that these truths are so obvious, at least they were to the people of the time, that there was no need to go into justification as to why they are there. It's obvious. Rules like 1 + 1 being equal to 2. Rules like I'm a human being and I have the ability to make decisions for myself, provided I'm not harming anyone in the process, directly. And amongst these self-evident rules were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And look, I paraphrase, but look, anyone that hasn't read the Declaration of Independence and wants to make rulings in regards to whether or not certain things are in violation of rights need to start there. Because the people that wrote this thing, the Founding Fathers, they had an absolutely flawless understanding of rights. Understanding of these axiomatic principles that we understand to all have. And Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the most brilliant figures at the time, and look, before people make this argument, Thomas Jefferson, oh, he had slaves, do a bit of research. You'll find that he was actually an abolitionist, devoted much of his life towards freeing slaves. He inherited them, and at the time, granted, it was illegal to actually free your slaves, and he feared doing so for their own safety, along with Benjamin Franklin, who also set up the first abolitionist society in Philadelphia. And these people campaigned to abolish slavery, and they did this before any other country had started to do this, at least in the known world at the time. Although at least one of the first people to abolish this thing, people still want to make arguments and cheap jibes in regards to how they were bad people, and people will always do that regardless of what you do. But need I digress? They had a brilliant understanding of philosophy. They had done a lot of research. The Founding Fathers developed their ideas based off of the philosophy of Locke, which dealt with property rights, human rights, and based off of devoting a tremendous amount of their time towards researching ancient Greek philosophy, ancient Roman philosophy, hermeneutical sciences. Thomas Jefferson had apparently one of the biggest libraries in the known world at the time. And they formulated these ideas because they're the ideas that every just society should be founded on, the ideas of liberty. And the only purpose of government was to not defend people, not to protect people, but to protect their individual rights. In the Declaration of Independence, they speak about how governments are instituted by the people in order to protect the individual rights of the people, not to be tyrannical. And they went on further to say that once a government starts to enact tyrannical laws, and they gave many examples of this, and it's fascinating when you read these things because it shows how the United States, the U.S. government has violated all of these examples of what a tyrannical government does. At least most of them, if not all of them. But fundamentally, the whole idea is that we have these rights. And granted, it's not only the rights that were expressed within the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but granted, among these rights were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were not the only rights. The problem now, though, is that people have come up with all of these rights. They continually add more and more and more rights to the list, not realizing that a right can only be a right if it does not violate the rights of others. Thomas Jefferson went on to define liberty and then rightful liberty. Liberty being the ability to do anything that you want. But rightful liberty, which is what we generally refer to as liberty, being the right to do anything you want, provided it does not violate the individual rights of others. But of course, we have the situation now where people are constantly coming up with all of these rights to violate the individual rights of others, and they're expressed within rights like the right to be secure, the right to not be offended. And this is the problem. And of course, we have a situation now where people are wanting to take away the most important of rights, which is the right to defend your rights. Now, granted, we have a government that is supposed to defend these rights. This government has become tyrannical. And look, the system of government that was formed, it was not perfect. I mean, I believe when the United States was formed, there was some kind of land tax that people would pay in order to have some kind of a military presence in order to defend the country. But realistically, this was voluntary in that if people did not want to purchase certain lands, they did not have to. Now, over time, all of these other taxes have come into play. Income tax. Taxes that are forcible. They're essentially extortion. And this is, once again, the government enacting draconian laws, violating the rights of individuals. And once they violate these things, the people should not support them. And it is not only their right, but it is their duty to dethrone this kind of government. And this is the situation we're in the moment. We have a government in the United States that has violated many of the rights and continues to do so, to the point where they're on the verge of violating the most sacrosanct of laws, the right for people to defend their rights. And the reason that the Second Amendment is in play, the reason it is so important, is that without this right, granted the government has become tyrannical, and granted that the government has the ability to actually violate the rights of individuals, the only way the individual can protect themselves is through the use of arms to defend themselves. There's nothing wrong with being in a situation where you have a weapon that has ability to enact force to defend your rights. But people somehow want to look at that as being violence in of itself. Anyway, I don't want to bore you with the rationale for this, but let's go on further to have a look at her views in regards to why she thinks that we need to take away the rights of individuals or have gun control, which itself is somewhat misleading, in that essentially when you are advocating for gun control, you're not advocating for the removal of guns, but simply shifting the power of one group of people to have guns to another group of people that have a monopoly on violence, the government, the police force.
Automatic or semi-automatic weapon. In Florida, to buy a gun, you do not need a permit, you do not need a gun license, and once you buy it, you do not need to register it. You do not need a permit to carry a concealed rifle or shotgun. You can buy as many guns as you want at one time. I read something very powerful to me today. It was from the point of view of a teacher. And I quote, "When adults tell me I have the right to own a gun, all I can hear is, my right to own a gun outweighs your student's right to live. All I can hear is blind..."
That classic argument, my right to own a gun outweighs your right to live. The people speak in subjective, poetic patterns. I mean, the idea of me holding a gun outweighs your right to live. Me holding a gun is not violating your right to live. And making the assumption that it does is just poor thinking. The act of owning a gun is not any active violence. Simply owning something. For instance, if I held a particular object, because of its potentiality to do harm, you want to look at that as being somehow a violation of your right to live? I'm not violating your right. You're right. If I was violating your life as far as actually doing something, the action of actually harming you, for instance, stabbing you, assaulting you, I would not have a right to do that. For instance, ultimately you cannot have a right that violates the rights of others, and this is the problem that so many people fall into. But the idea of simply owning a weapon, because statistically, potentially, people always want to lump in potentiality with actuality, always want to deal in terms of what if, as opposed to the present. The present moment is the only moment that people should deal in. But philosophically, people don't make a distinction between the past, the future, and the present. They say because in the past we had all of these instances where people that owned your weapon committed violence to others, and because by you holding a weapon, even though it is doing nothing, because in the future it may cause harm, that means that you're violating my right to life. No, I'm not violating your right to life. I'm not using that weapon. I simply have that weapon. I mean, even if I didn't have a weapon, the fact that I could go out into a store and buy a weapon, or I could buy a weapon on the black market, the fact that I have the potentiality to do that right now, according to that kind of logic, means that I'm violating your right to life. Like this whole idea of weighing your right to a gun to violating your right to life. Owning a gun does not in any way, shape, or form violate someone's right to life. Unless you're dealing in this potentiality realm that a lot of people want to deal in. There's nothing inherently wrong in passively having a weapon, because the action in of itself of having a weapon is not an action. I may have a weapon, I may have the ability to go get a weapon, but unless, of course, it is active, unless I'm actually using that weapon on you, I'm not violating your right. And it's just, it's such a misleading language that people I find often use.
Mine. Studying our notes to make sure that our arguments based on politics and political history are watertight. The students of this school have been having debates on guns for what feels like our entire lives. AP Gov had about 3 debates this year.
Absolutely. She's essentially making the point that we need to make sure our understanding of political history is watertight. And the problem is, look, I don't know what they're teaching people in these schools, but clearly they're not teaching them about the whole philosophy of rights. As to how these rights were established by the Founding Fathers, as to why they were established. And they were established because you cannot have a free society unless, of course, people have these individual rights. The problem is people have this subjective understanding of rights, therefore think that by simply having a gun, it is a violation of someone's right. People fall into this idea of thinking because there can be amendments to the Constitution, there can be any amendments that you want provided it's done democratically. No. Now, look, granted that this is allowed within the Constitution, the idea of people through the democratic process to make amendments in the Constitution, but these are supposed to be within the confines of natural law. Now, the idea of adding rights that violate other people's rights are not rights. They are what you call positive rights. You cannot have a right that infringes upon the rights of others. Therefore, a right to your security, this subjective idea that someone has that having a weapon has the potential to cause harm, therefore it is an infringement of my security. The idea, you could easily make the argument that because someone is black and because they're statistically more likely to perform violence, they are a threat to me. That's not an actual right. This whole idea of security. Security is not a right. Neither is the right to education. These are privileges. Neither is the right to health care. If it's predicated on a governmental system taxing people by force, extortion, yes, taxation is theft. Any situation where you're taking something and then it doesn't matter what you're doing after that. If you're taking something by force without consent, it's not a right. Unless people actually agree to this thing, not through some airy-fairy social contract, but have actually given their explicit consent to actually want to voluntarily give up their funds. And look, you could address this quite easily in having a society where people can actually donate to the government system. And the only right that a government, if you want to call the government, has is the right to actually protect individual rights. But the problem is, of course,
Some discussions on the subject.
subjectively, people will always determine their rights to be whatever they want. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure the Founding Fathers expressed this as well. You cannot have a free society unless, of course, one, the people are free, and the people have an understanding of freedom. When we have a society where our youth are born into this collectivist notion that your potential to cause harm is a violation of my right, then you'll never have freedom. This fundamental issue comes down to the fundamental understanding of rights and freedom. And it doesn't matter what people want to call themselves. You can call yourself someone that believes in freedom, someone that is a Satanist, someone that is a Christian, but you need to understand that you cannot infringe upon someone's inalienable rights. That is why the term was used in the Declaration of Independence, because these rights are inalienable. Regardless of what you want in society, you cannot force people to give you that thing unless they are infringing upon your own right to life, liberty. Anyway, rather than spending another half an hour breaking down this talk here, look, without a doubt, it was a very passionate argument. And yes, I think it is incumbent upon us to create a society where we become less violent. And if you can convince people to give up their guns voluntarily, now granted, I may not think that that is the best idea. Why do you ask? Because historically, let me just give you guys an idea of what's happened historically. I wrote an article actually recently on Steemit addressing the whole idea of rights from an objectivist standpoint. And look, historically, this is a quote from, I don't know where I got this from, but essentially this maps out a brief history of what's happened in regards to guns and the massacre of individuals by governments. In 1929, the Soviet Union established gun control. From 1929 to 1953, about 20 million dissidents unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. In 1911, Turkey established gun control. From 1915 to 1917, 1.5 million Armenians unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. Germany established gun control in 1938. And from 1939 to 1945, a total of 13 million Jews and others were unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and exterminated. But you're saying that would never happen here? Look at what happened in Australia. We voluntarily gave up our guns. Well, no, we didn't. The Australian government had a buyback campaign where essentially it forced people to give up their guns and sold it to them, but that's forced. Anytime you do something and it's not voluntary or it's based under coercive violence, so you either do this or we'll lock you up, that's not voluntary. It's not something that's been done voluntarily. And look, granted, you can say that, well, nothing's happened so far. And look, the Armenians could have said the same thing. I mean, look, 1915 to 1917, in 1911, the Turkish, when they gave up their guns, I mean, granted, they hadn't received any authoritative measures by their government in 1912 or 1913, but it was 1915 and 17 that they did that. And look, granted, from 1929 to 1953, in 1929, the Soviet Union established gun control. Fair enough, but it took what, 10 years or so before the government decided to massacre them. What I'm saying is to make the argument that nothing has happened now as far as the government abusing its power and killing lots of innocent people, so it's unlikely to happen. It's not really an argument. The price of freedom is to be ever vigilant with the protection of your freedom. And that requires the ability to use the necessary amount of force in order to thwart violent actions. And that is to have a gun or whatever weapon that you believe is necessary to use as a deterrent. Now, the argument that because it's unlikely, we live in a time now where guns are far more destructive than they were back in the time of the Founding Fathers. Well, here's the thing. This whole thing is not about guns. This is about people's ability to protect their rights, regardless of whether or not you want to look at the Second Amendment. It fundamentally comes down to this idea that provided someone is not harming someone, they have a right to defend themselves. People will always try to find lawyer loopholes. For instance, the classic example is associating potentiality, the potential for harm, with actual harm. Something that seems to be widespread within the thinking of so many of the leftists, of these metrosexuals out there, who proclaim that we need to live in a world of peace. Yeah, and that by having a gun, that's violence. No, that's a potential, but not actual violence. Anyway, let's go on to let's further go into this analysis. So Germany established gun control in 1938, and from 1939 to 1945, a total of 30 million Jews and others were unable to defend themselves.
Okay, I found this on the web for necessary amount of force in order to.
Siri's trying to help me out over here. Guatemala established gun control in 1964. From 1964 to 1981, 100,000 Mayan Indians unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. Uganda established gun control in 1970. From 1971 to 1979, 300,000 Christians unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. Cambodia! I recently had this conversation with this Asian friend of mine just a while back, and he was saying, "Man, what people do you think are the most persecuted people, man? Think black people or Asian people are more persecuted?" I'm like, well, look, blacks went through all this slave. Yeah, man. And then he went into the history of Cambodia, the history people like Pol Pot, all the shit that they've done, the millions and millions of people that they have killed. The things that the Chinese suffered under Genghis Khan. I mean, look, man, persecution has happened tremendously in all different aspects of the world, in all different parts of the world, particularly in Cambodia. And whereas a lot of people feel persecuted, as brothers from the United States, people forget that the history of violence being performed by authoritative governmental regimes has a long history. And Cambodia, which established gun control in 1956, from 1975 to 1977, 1 million educated people unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. Defenseless people rounded up and exterminated in the 20th century because of gun control. 56 million. That's the amount. 56 million people rounded up and exterminated in the 20th century because of gun control. Which, by the way, need I remind you, is not the abolition of guns, but is simply shifting the power of guns from the individual to the government. Centralization of power. It always comes down to it. Centralization. And this is what we're trying to establish. That any time where any organization, be that government, be that company, has a monopoly on violence, and therefore has a centralization of power, it can lead to this fucked up system where they abuse that violence, that power. Now, granted, we may have not seen that happen recently. I mean, we had the Port Arthur Massacre in Australia. What was that? God, that was maybe 20 years back. I don't know, give or take. I think I was in year 10 when that happened. God, so yeah, it's been a long time. But just because we haven't had any massive incidents since then doesn't mean that that's not unlikely to happen again. Now, granted, personally, I don't want to see guns in my neighborhood because I don't know how to use them. But look, if it was the kind of environment where I was seeing violence, I would like to have the ability to defend myself. And regardless of whether or not I wanted to, it is my right. Rights are not determined by the state. They are, as expressed within the Declaration of Independence, not determined by man, but handed by God. Now, I know this sounds a little metaphysical and people don't want to get all spiritual with this, but fundamentally, you don't have to adopt this idea that they're granted to you by your Creator. But you can simply accept the idea that fundamentally, we all have this because we own ourselves. You own yourself. Or better yet, no one else owns you. Therefore, by virtue of that, you have a right to do what you want, provided you are not violating the rights of the individual. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, look, whereas I realize the gun debate is a very tumultuous, heated debate, and by no means do I want to rub people the wrong way by discussing this, but I think it's important for people to understand that this entire argument freedom, doesn't come from what people think is going to be the best thing. People aren't making this because they have this utopian view of society, even though a lot of people do believe that having rights and having the freest society will lead to the best society. And there are many examples of this. It comes down to the fact that these rights are immutable. They're inalienable. You cannot change them. It would be equivalent to me stealing something from you and saying, hey, it's going to lead to good. But that's not how things are supposed to work. Granted, we all want things and people want to survive, want to feel like they're likely to survive. You have to do these within the confines of people's rights. And as soon as you don't, you can't have any kind of a society that is based off of fairness. This is from the stance of freedom. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at some other issues in the moment. There are a couple of other things I wanted to touch on this podcast before I go too deeply into the whole gun debate issue. That's something I could speak about ad nauseum. But I think a far more fascinating thing that's going on in the world at the moment is in the world of Bitcoin, or cryptocurrencies per se. Last year was an avalanche of crypto mayhem. We saw so much adoption by so many merchants, so many people around the world. We saw the price of Bitcoin reach almost 20,000 US dollars, about 25,000 Australian dollars, and people are really starting to dip their toes into the world of cryptocurrencies. Now, granted, we saw this massive crash during the start of the year. If you want to call it a crash, I mean, a lot of people say that Bitcoin's crashed and that it's the end of Bitcoin, but they've been saying that since it went from $30 to $2, since it went from $256 to $50, and now again from $20,000 to $10,000 to $6,000. This is not so much some unexpected side effect of Bitcoin, but this is pretty much a feature. It's very volatile. Obviously, at the moment where it doesn't have the massive market cap of a lot of fiat currencies, it's a bit like a boat in this massive sea. And in a small boat, the Bitcoin market cap being this small boat, obviously you're going to see a lot of volatility, but as more adoption takes place, as we see this hyper-Bitcoinization, people start investing more and more money into Bitcoin, becomes larger, and people start using this thing not just as a store of value and not just as a speculative currency as it's being used by a lot of people at the moment, but actually start seeing this as a better form of money, and that it does what money does at the moment better than a lot of other currencies. Now, granted, it's not stable as far as the price goes. More adoption, and as the boat, before I digress too far with my analogy, as the boat gets bigger and bigger and bigger, more adoption takes place. It becomes more stable in this massive sea, in this massive market, and you don't see as much volatility. But it's undeniable that Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies are here to stay. Now, whereas there's a lot of dispute as to whether or not Bitcoin Core, which brings me into the whole Bitcoin Civil War thing, but Bitcoin, for the purpose of simplicity, let's refer to it as Bitcoin, what most people are familiar with. Yeah, now, it may not be the most established Bitcoin by the end of this year, the most used Bitcoin, but cryptocurrencies in and of themselves, they are here to stay. I mean, it is undeniable that once you find a better form of money, good money will chase away the bad money. And what I mean by that is once you find money does something better than other forms of money, it meets the characteristics of sound money better than anything else. Bitcoin, obviously, being scarce with 21 million coins, it being fungible, being able to be broken down into many different divisions, it being portable, being able to be transported from one person to another without having to physically carry it, unlike gold, fiat currencies, paper money. I mean, if I wanted to travel to, let's say, Andes, Mallorca, hell, just got to remember my private key in my head. I arrive there, and I have access to my money. It's perfect, and it's more durable. I mean, we're using the cryptographic system, the SHA-256, I think it's called. This is something from the NSA. This is like special, like secret service kind of shit. It's like we've stolen this shit from the bad guys, applied it, and made something for the people. This is a common theme we find in history. The internet apparently was made by DARPA, by the establishment, so to speak, if you want to call it that. But I think DARPA is the kind of organization that's doing a lot of good stuff. But we've taken this technology, and now it's become the most revolutionary technology for freedom. Similarly, this is what you find with Bitcoin. Now, in regards to the Bitcoin civil war, one of the things that has been going on the Twitter sphere, I've never seen anything like it in my entire life, is this battle of which is going to be the best coin. But more importantly, the idea that one coin is a shitty coin, is a scam coin, and the other is the only legit true coin. And people are forgetting, first and foremost, that no one owns Bitcoin. It is decentralized. Now, unlike fiat currencies where people can force you to use a particular currency, or you don't have the right to create another currency, and if you do, you'll be jailed, people can choose whatever currency they want, provided they are aware of how this currency works. There's nothing wrong that is going on here. Regardless of what coin you want to use, it's irrelevant. Now, people always make the argument, you find that they're essentially, to give you an idea what's happened, around August, there was what you call a fork that took place between Bitcoin and, Bitcoin Core. For simplicity, let's just refer to it as Bitcoin. What most people are aware of as Bitcoin Core, that essentially forked around August, and now we have Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Core, or Bitcoin Legacy, also referred to as Bitcoin Core, and Bitcoin Cash. Now, the fundamental issue at play was this issue dealing with scalability. You have one group of people feeling that Bitcoin needs to focus on its decentralization more than anything in order to have this thing truly thrive, have a form of currency that cannot be shut down by the alphabet crew, government, so to speak. It needs to be decentralized so that you can't have a central point where the government can hone down on you and shut you down. And when you have larger blocks, this all comes down to something called the scaling issue, where you have essentially, anytime that you make a transaction in Bitcoin, when you send a transaction, this transaction is put on a block, and miners essentially mine this block, and essentially, depending on how large the block is, that'll determine how fast the transaction how fast it'll take in order for the transaction to complete. Now, of course, the problem with that is that when you have small block sizes and you have this massive adoption of Bitcoin, there's so many people that when you have these small blocks, it's hard to get transactions done fast. And the only way to increase the speed is to increase the block size. Now, the problem is that when you increase the block size, it requires more powerful computers. The miners that essentially mine these blocks, they solve these complex problems, these cryptographic problems. They essentially solve these cryptographic problems by mining these blocks. And the only way they're able to be rewarded on the system is if they have a powerful enough computer, because they're all competing to mine this block. And if they don't have a powerful enough computer, they won't be as likely to get paid their Bitcoins. Now, what happens when you increase the block size in order to increase the speed, to reduce the congestion, it means that other people will need to have more sophisticated computers miners in order to mine the block. Now, I'm going to try to wind this thing down because I want to keep these podcasts down to about an hour. But essentially, as I was saying, when you increase the block size, now granted, it can speed things up, but it's going to require more centralization, require people that have more powerful computers only being able to mine these blocks. And the problem with that is that if you have a system, if you have this Bitcoin system where only people that are affluent enough, have resources, can mine, then you can have these massive organizations that have a monopoly on mining, and it becomes easier for the governments to come in and shut them down. Now, this is unavoidable. Centralization is not a Boolean. Something is either centralized or it's not centralized. The idea is that there will always be levels of centralization. Ultimately, you're trying to find a balance between centralization and effectiveness. If you have a system that people can't use because it doesn't it has no utility. For instance, around late December last year, it was incredibly difficult to send a transaction. You'd send a transaction, and it took me 2 weeks to process a transaction, at a point when we were seeing a massive crash in Bitcoin, the value of Bitcoin. I wanted to get my money, couldn't do that. At that point in time, I became frustrated, and I realized that, oh, wait a sec, this shit that Roger Ver, one of the biggest investor of Bitcoin, was saying about the problems of Bitcoin Core were clear, that it was massively congested, that the need to have this an upgrade of the block sizes was necessary. Now, granted, Bitcoin Core is focused on making solutions to this problem using code development. Now, the other argument from Bitcoin Cash, one of the prevailing arguments is that whereas Bitcoin Cash may be more centralized in regards to block sizes, Bitcoin Core is more centralized in that the developers have made decisions and they have more control over what gets done, as opposed to having this system where anyone can suggest ideas. You have multiple groups that are working on suggestions for the updating of the Bitcoin protocol. Bearing in mind, Bitcoin is completely open source, and it's not controlled by one entity per se, but you'll generally find there'll always be certain groups, certain organizations that are adding the majority of changes. And of course, when it becomes a bit more technical, you have certain groups that have access to certain aspects of Bitcoin that no one else has. For instance, Satoshi originally handed over the certain keys to Gavin Andresen, which was access to the repository that allows you to make certain changes in Bitcoin. And Gavin Andresen, in the spirit of decentralization, handed over those keys to certain groups of people, meaning that not everyone had access to the repository. Now, unfortunately, Gavin Andresen was actually shut out by certain groups of people at some point, because he started saying things that certain people felt was not in line with Bitcoin as far as the direction that they wanted. One of these things being advocating that Craig Wright was Satoshi, which for people that have actually been following this thing, it's pretty evident who Satoshi actually is, and there are reasons as to why Craig Wright, Satoshi, does not want to come out. And it deals with, one, this whole idea of decentralization. I mean, you don't want this thing falling to one person. And what's happened with characters like Ross Ulbricht, who essentially made a website that allowed people to trade items with Bitcoin, with cryptocurrency. The U.S. government, the Alphabet crew, decided to hone in on this guy and say, well, you created something and you're affiliated with it, and we're going to come up with some trumped-up bullshit in order to incarcerate you. Now he's serving 3 life sentences. Now, in regards to the whole scenario with Satoshi and Bitcoin, look, it doesn't matter. I mean, realistically, there isn't a single thing that Satoshi could do to actually definitively prove that he is Satoshi. People did not want to believe that. But as far as what he has done, I'm talking about Craig Wright here, it's pretty obvious to people that aren't massively skeptical. There are certain people, and this is a common thing within the crypto world. People don't want to believe something unless there's a preponderance of evidence for it. But because of the human tendency to want to believe things not based off of rationale and reason, but based off of emotional conviction, you'll find that more often than not, people invest in a particular cryptocurrency, in a particular ideology, not because it makes sense, but because they want it to be. And this is the debate I find that is often going on in regards to Bitcoin, in regards to Craig Wright. But in regards to the evidence around this, bearing in mind that this is indisputable. Now, granted, Craig Wright apparently came out unwillingly because around the time, certain news organizations had been reporting that he may be Satoshi. Now, because of pressure from people around Craig Wright in order to come out, according to Craig Wright, he finally did, reluctantly, and provided his private key, signed a message with his public key, bearing in mind that this is not definitive evidence. And around the time he did this, later on, certain key people in the industry that have some kind of a credibility when it comes to understanding cryptography came out and said that, look, this could have been forged through the blockchain, and that this is not definitive proof. And a lot of people being reluctant in regards to Craig Wright's validity, just based off of their own intuition, not being sufficiently pleased with the way in which he conducted himself, his tone, his body language, other subjective ideas, believe that it probably wasn't. And granted, it's true. It's potentially possible that someone could have gained the public key. Therefore, later on, if you actually follow the story, Craig Wright actually provided his private key, signed a message. Now, this is in a interview, with a meeting with Gavin Andresen, the key developer of Bitcoin. Now, according to Gavin Andresen, he was massively skeptical and agreed to meet up with Satoshi, or Craig Wright. And now, granted, he was so skeptical that he, upon having Craig Wright sign this message in order to prove that he was actually Satoshi, he asked for a new computer and basically did other things to ensure that this was absolutely legitimate. Craig Wright was able to provide his private key and sign both the first block, the Genesis block, with his private key. Now, for those of us that actually believe in the veracity of Gavin Andresen, there's really, in my opinion, no reason to not believe the fact that he's telling the truth, unless you are one of these conspiracy theorists that believe that Gavin Andresen may be Satoshi, which is kind of stupid in that, one, he's actually said he's not, and the evidence for it, the fact that he had this tremendous reluctance in believing that Craig Wright was Satoshi, but agreed to fly there, and whereas it really doesn't make sense to be willing to do that, and then put his reputation on the line in saying that Craig Wright was actually Satoshi when he provided that evidence. But look, the bottom line is, if you believe in the words of Gavin Andresen, if you actually believe what he's telling you is true, then it's undeniable. It's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt that what Craig Wright is actually saying. Granted, he's done this privately with his own private key, which is pretty much definitive. I mean, the only other thing that you could do more definitive than this is to actually say that you were going to move a certain amount of money. I mean, everyone can see the Satoshi's address, apparently. They understand that there's a certain amount of Bitcoins that are assigned to Satoshi, and if this had been moved, we'd know that this has obviously been moved by Satoshi. Now, granted, Craig Wright could say that he's going to move this at a particular point, and if he did that, people would generally say, look, yeah, fair enough, this is enough evidence, but there'd still be people that would be telling you that, look, he may have stolen these keys, and it's not Satoshi. But as far as I'm concerned, for anyone that doesn't have any bias, it's pretty obvious that if you believe Gavin Andresen, and furthermore, if you believe John Matonis, who is the most credible figure, I mean, this guy is the head of the Bitcoin Foundation, and not only has Craig Wright signed the first message, block 1 and block 9, in the presence of John Matonis, but John Matonis also made Craig Wright go through various other tests dealing with his understanding of the technology around Bitcoin and other tests in order to prove the validity around what he was saying. And this has all been done. Now, granted, this hasn't been done publicly. Now, why on earth would anyone do this publicly when if you could verify publicly that you were Satoshi, you'd be putting yourself at risk? And we all know that Satoshi from day one has never wanted to come out. I mean, there are many complications towards coming out, and there's also other reasons as to why he doesn't want to release this information. It actually made Gavin Andresen sign a non-disclosure of some sort, I believe. And it deals with contracts that may be in play dealing with his organization. Now, granted that Craig Wright is supposed to be the Satoshi, using the pseudonym Satoshi. Now, we all know that he wasn't the only figure in creating this. For all we know, I mean, essentially saying that, look, granted, he didn't create all this himself. It's been created by many other people. We all know that the actual Bitcoin that we use has been developed. Now, granted, the design has all been created by a particular group of people. One of the main figures is Craig Wright. And even if there wasn't this evidence at play, this is the thing that I find very fascinating. If you take away the most credible evidence in regards to Satoshi, dealing with the fact that he has signed the Genesis block, according to John Matonis and Gavin Andresen, and you actually decide to listen to his talks, you actually go through all the videos on YouTube, and you have a basic, let's say a B or C grade understanding even of how Bitcoin works. And look, I'm not saying I have any A-level understanding. My understanding of this stuff is still very rudimentary. Whereas I understand the architecture and the philosophy behind this stuff, because I've been interested in this from a voluntarist position for quite some years. It's only recently that I've delved into the understanding of the technology, the architectural design, and in regards to actually using Bitcoin, I'm still a noob. I've only been using this thing for less than 6 months. But in regards to understanding how this whole thing works, look, I've taken upon myself to read the white paper, to understand the basics, and when you listen to enough information about a particular topic, you start cross-referencing the information, you gain a picture of how things work. And I've listened to the major proponents discussing how Bitcoin works, like not only Gavin Andreessen, but Andreas Antonopoulos, going through all the videos on his channel, and I'm telling you, when it comes to understanding this shit, explaining stuff that actually makes sense to me, that I actually get, I haven't come across anyone that has more knowledge about this shit than Craig Wright. And that is a bold statement, because I've gone through a lot of stuff. I've listened to both the arguments in favor of Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Cash, and in regards to what is going to be more effective based off of economics and technology, look, it's neither here or there. I'm inclined to think, from my own philosophical bias, in that I don't see competition as being a bad thing, and centralization of power to some extent, granted if it's done competitively, and you have businesses that are willing that have more powerful computers, and they can use these to mine the blocks, and we can get faster interactions. Yeah, I favor that, because I want something that actually works. But it's very clear when you listen to all the arguments, and then you listen to the most knowledgeable people in regards to this issue. It's very clear that Craig Wright is amongst the top people, and you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone that has a better understanding of how this entire system works than Craig Wright. So even if, through some miracle, he's not actually the Satoshi that everyone is referring to, has used this pseudonym, it would be virtually impossible for him not to have worked on this, to have the level of knowledge and understandings that far surpasses anyone that I've listened to on this particular issue, being able to explain the details in regards to it. Only things that people that have been working on this from the earliest days would have an understanding of. But it all adds up. When you have a look at the circumstantial evidence around the time he was in Australia, and the Australian Taxation Department decided to look at what he was doing, because he basically cashed out his bitcoins, $36 million worth. It's very obvious what is going on. But the thing is, because of bias, this will never be accepted within the fundamental Bitcoin community, crypto community, because people don't want to accept it. So there's my rant in regard to Satoshi, Bitcoin, the Civil War, and gun rights. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to wind it there. This has been pretty tumultuous podcast. I know I've been touching on some very controversial issues here. I find, as I alluded to earlier, anytime we're dealing with a topic that is emotionally charged, people will often allow their emotions to take precedence, both with gun rights and with cryptocurrencies. To me, it's not about what I think is going to work. It's about what people have a right to do. Freedom. If people choose to use, once again, a currency that they voluntarily agree to, that they want to use, they're not forced into using one system, unlike with the current fiat system, whereas you have a system where a nation, a government says that you must use this currency, otherwise you get into trouble. If you try to create another currency, we will make it illegal. And we will have this central banking system where we can regulate the currency, and we can print lots of money and devalue your hard-earned dollar. It's still money for you collectively over time. If you're not in line with that, and you believe that people should have a right to choose what currency they want to use, obviously you don't see a problem with Bitcoin. If you're someone that buys in this whole Keynesian school of economics, and you maintain that people need to be taxed, people need to have their money or the currency regulated by the government in order to avoid crashes, in order to avoid booms and busts and all of this other financial nonsense that people speak about, well, you're obviously on the side of tyranny. Obviously, you're on the side of doing what we must do in order to have security, as opposed to doing what is right because you have principles. And this is what I love about Bitcoin. It's instilling the ideas of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment era. established by the founding fathers, established by all the greatest philosophers, the idea of individual rights, liberty, the idea of morality as such, definitively speaking, not along the lines of collectivism, of trying to do what is in the interest of the many, in the detriment of the few. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave it there. They're my thoughts on Bitcoin, on gun rights. I wanted to play a video for everyone, just one little video that may upset some people. This deals with the whole gun rights issue. This shows what can actually happen when you are having your rights violated upon, and how guns can actually be useful in protecting your rights. And this is a classic scenario of what can happen when people can use their guns to defend themselves. I'm going to play this video. Hope you guys like it, and leave it there. No words. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave it there. And on that note, look, the decision is in your hands. Fundamentally, look, I'm in Australia. We've obviously given up our guns, but for those of you that reside in the United States, where you have at least some of your basic liberties in regards to the most important of all, the most important liberty, which is your right to defend your rights. Yeah, I guess you have to decide whether or not you want security or whether or not you want freedom. And yeah, I'm going to leave it there. But ladies and gentlemen, just finally, I would highly recommend you guys checking out my EP. I recently released an EP, Going Thunder, which you can check out. I'm going to play the advertisement for this thing. It's a 4-track EP. Have a copy of it right over here. If you guys want to check out my EP, it is on iTunes, Spotify, all digital outlets, and I shall be allowing some options for people to purchase this thing through cryptocurrencies very soon, if you're interested. But here's the promo video for it.
You know, people in this life, they'll always tell you what you can and what you cannot do. You can't let nobody put limitations on yourself. You gotta know that deep down inside, you got the will, you got the power, you got the fire. So if you wanna go, you gotta go like thunder. We'll have to beat you on the motion. Bring home the rain, need no introduction. Have a moment, ponder on that weakness. Rise above it, keep working on that game, son. I'm about to school you and I thunder. I'm a ring, I groove, you know I got some.
Boom, shakalaka. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Crystal Journey Podcast. Be sure to send us a comment. Let us know what you think in regards to this podcast. Tell your friends, tell your mom, share this if you enjoy doing this thing. This is something I do because I believe in freedom, and also I think it's a great opportunity to connect with like-minded people around the world and to promote myself as a musician. So peace out, keep it real. Until next time, this is the Crucial Journey. Ow!
Told me that it can't be done, but I told you the battle was over before the game was done. Now if you think that I'm gonna let you run my body, my heart, and my mind, then you better listen, son. Oh, you think you're invaluable, you act like an eagle, then you're gonna soar like a bird beyond impossible. I think it's plain to see, you know you're meant to be one swan, two worlds, serve two. Gotta think and stop. What you want, you always what you get. You don't do the work right, you won't find your best. You won't work it, you gon' pay the price. You won't work it, gon' pay the price. You won't work it, gon' pay the price. You won't make it. I don't even care where this road leads. All I know is when my heart is, gotta live a dream. We believe in, throw my hands up, touch the ceiling. I don't even care where this road leads. All I know is when my heart is, gotta live a dream. Keep believing, hold my hands up, touch the ceiling. It seems that you were a liar, that you shouldn't mess with the fire. Don't have to build to succeed, but you're kicking ass Bruce Lee. You want it, you got it.